Rico, Douglas had spent the last 5 years as a space explorer, and in that time, he'd survived hostile alien encounters, outwitted savage predators, and even accidentally started a civil war between two warring planets. He was the cocky, quick-witted adventurer who prided himself on getting out of tight situations, sometimes by sheer luck, other times by sheer audacity. No one had a higher opinion of Ray than Ray himself. So when his ship made its way to Vrixia, a planet he'd never heard of, he thought it was just another in a long line of dull, bureaucratic missions. After all, he was used to alien diplomacy being a bore, full of speeches, negotiations, and bland cultural exchanges. This, however, was not going to be like any other mission. Zara, the Vrixian ambassador, was a towering 8-foot woman. Ray had seen his fair share of strange-looking aliens, but Zara was something else entirely. Her muscles were as defined as an Olympic weightlifter's, and her eyes held a deep intensity that made Ray feel like he was facing down a force of nature. She was everything Ray wasn't: serious, disciplined, and undeniably intimidating. But as far as Ray could tell, the most important thing about Zara was that she was terrifyingly strong. The initial meeting was awkward, to say the least. Ray, ever the charmer, greeted Zara with what he thought was a respectful bow. She responded by raising an eyebrow, seemingly unimpressed. He tried again, offering her a handshake, but she merely stared at his hand like it was some strange earthling ritual. So he pulled it back with an awkward chuckle, muttering something about how humans weren't great with formalities. Zara wasted no time getting to the point. "Human, I have invited you to my planet for a very important reason," she said, her deep voice resonating with an air of authority. "We Vrixians are a proud species. Strength is our way. And I seek a worthy mate to prove that strength, to show my people the might of another species." Ray's brain immediately short-circuited. "Mate?" he blurted out before he could stop himself. His eyes widened. "Wait, you mean like a bonding thing?" Zara's lips curled into the faintest of smiles, but the humor didn't reach her eyes. "Indeed. I will test your endurance, your stamina. Only the strongest survive the bonding ritual." Ray, at this point, was already running through several scenarios in his head, most of which involved a lot of sweat, heavy breathing, and possibly some intimate activities. He grinned. "I'm no slouch when it comes to stamina," he said, puffing his chest out. "You might be 8 feet tall, but I've been known to hold my own." Zara's gaze didn't waver. "I hope you can keep up, human. You will be tested both physically and mentally." Ray, still thinking in terms of physical challenges, mentally prepared himself for whatever bonding ritual this was. After all, he wasn't about to let a giant alien woman intimidate him. He'd been through worse, and he had a reputation to maintain. He flexed his arms and did a couple of exaggerated stretches, still missing the point entirely. Zara gestured toward a large open space that seemed to be a training ground of sorts. "Your first test will be one of strength," she said, pointing to a huge rock formation. "Climb that. Show me your grip, your stamina. And remember, if you fail, you will not be allowed to complete the ritual." Ray blinked, his bravado faltering for just a moment. He had expected something, well, different. Still, he couldn't back out now. He adjusted his space suit and approached the rock. It was massive, and as he began climbing, he quickly realized this was not a casual challenge. Zara had clearly underestimated how much he needed to work up to it. He could feel the burn in his arms and legs, his breathing quickening with each movement. The entire time, Zara stood there, watching. Her expression was unreadable, almost clinical. Ray couldn't tell if she was impressed, or just waiting for him to fall so she could laugh in his face. He continued to climb, each movement slow but deliberate, trying to ignore the weight of her gaze. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he reached the top and pulled himself over the edge, panting for breath. Zara stood motionless, giving him no verbal praise. Instead, she nodded once, sharply. "You have completed the first test. Now, the next one." Ray let out a nervous laugh. "That was it? No gold star for effort?" Zara didn't respond. Instead, she started walking toward a massive pit that stretched far beneath them. Ray's stomach dropped. Wait, what is that? Are we jumping in? Because, I don't think I'm ready to die today. Zara turned, her expression still unmoving. You will cross. I will time you. If you fall behind, you will be left behind. Ray groaned inwardly. What did he sign up for? But the idea of being left behind by an 8-foot-tall alien warrior didn't sit well with him. He couldn't let her see him flinch, so he followed her into the pit. It was even worse than it looked: sharp rocks, winding paths, and a strange mix of alien creatures watching from above. Zara led him through it with ease, while Ray struggled to keep up. Each time he caught up to her, she would leave him behind again, pushing herself even further, faster, without breaking a sweat. At one point, she stopped and looked at him, waiting. Are you done? She asked, her voice oddly patient, though her eyes gleamed with a hint of amusement. Ray's pride was at stake. No way. He gritted through clenched teeth. I'm just getting started. The struggle was exhausting, but it wasn't just about physical endurance anymore. The challenge had become a battle of willpower, and Ray wasn't going to lose to an alien who thought she could outlast him. He pushed forward, one step at a time, his body aching in ways he hadn't expected. By the time they finally emerged from the pit, Ray was winded, sweaty, and more than a little disoriented. He leaned against the wall, catching his breath, while Zara stood beside him, looking entirely unaffected. She had been right all along. This was a test, not just of strength, but of his resilience, his ability to endure, his will to push past limits. And yet, somehow, Ray had made it through. Zara glanced at him, her gaze softer now, but still firm. Well done, human, she said, and for the first time, there was a hint of something like respect in her voice. Ray grinned, wiping the sweat from his brow. Hey, not bad for a human, right? Zara merely nodded, as if the conversation was already over. You may survive the final test. But that will come later. Ray's heart raced. The final test? What could possibly top what they'd just gone through? Ray had barely caught his breath when Zara started walking again, her pace steady and unrelenting. He followed, trying to ignore the dull ache in his arms and legs. Whatever she had in mind for the next test, he wasn't sure he was ready for it. But there was no backing down now. Not after everything he'd been through. He was a human, damn it. Stubbornness was practically a survival trait at this point. Zara didn't offer any explanations, and that was just fine with Ray. He didn't need explanations. He'd been through enough near-death experiences to know that the less you knew, the less you could worry about. He jogged to catch up with her, wiping the sweat off his forehead. The air on Vrixia was thick, the sun beating down like a furnace, but Ray had learned to embrace discomfort in his line of work. They reached a large open area, a flat, barren field that stretched out for miles. Zara stopped in the middle of it and turned toward Ray, her posture straight, her eyes locked onto him like a predator ready to pounce. Ray came to a halt, trying to appear confident, even though his knees were beginning to shake from the strain of their earlier tests. This is the second test, Zara said, her tone unwavering. You will survive my challenge. I will watch. If you fail, you will not be allowed to bond with my people. Ray looked around. What exactly do I need to survive this time? A stampede of angry Vrixians? Zara's lips barely twitched, but it wasn't a smile. Close, she said. But not exactly. Before he could react, the ground beneath them began to rumble. Ray's eyes widened as massive shapes emerged from the ground. Large, scaly beasts, each with thick, ridged armor and vicious claws, crawled out of the earth. There were at least 6 of them, their massive forms blocking the sunlight as they rose to full height. They resembled giant serpents, but with the head of a bull, snorting clouds of smoke from their nostrils. Ray stared at them, his heart sinking into his stomach. He had faced deadly creatures before, but these things were on a whole different level. Each beast stood at least 15 feet tall, and their claws were sharp enough to tear through the toughest of materials. They didn't look friendly, and they sure as hell didn't look like they were here for a chat. Zara? Ray called, his voice rising in pitch. What exactly am I supposed to do about these things? Zara didn't flinch. She merely watched as one of the creatures charged forward, its jaws snapping. Ray had only a split second to react, his instincts kicking in. He ducked, narrowly avoiding the creature's teeth, and scrambled backward. The ground shook with every step it took, the noise deafening. This is your trial, human, Zara called calmly. Prove that you are worthy of my people. Ray rolled to the side as another beast lunged at him, its claws scraping the earth with terrifying force. He barely dodged it, feeling the wind from its massive paw as it missed by inches. His brain worked overtime, trying to come up with a plan. Charging at them seemed suicidal. Trying to fight them head-on was out of the question. These creatures were too strong, too fast. But Ray wasn't the kind of guy to give up so easily. He glanced around, searching for something, anything, that could help him. The answer came to him in an instant. There was a sharp incline leading up to a cliff on the far side of the field. If he could make it there, he could potentially gain some higher ground. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was the only one he had. He sprinted, zigzagging to avoid the creatures as they charged at him. He could feel his muscles screaming in protest, but there was no time to slow down. He wasn't about to let Zara see him fail. Not after everything. One of the creatures snapped at him from behind, its jaws nearly closing around his legs. Ray jumped to the side just in time, his heart pounding in his chest. The cliff was getting closer, but so were the beasts. He could hear them gaining on him, their growls echoing in the air. Finally, he reached the incline, scrambling up the rocky surface as fast as he could. His fingers burned as they scraped against the sharp stones, but he forced himself to keep climbing. He didn't have the luxury of stopping. He had to keep moving, or he'd be just another meal for these monsters. With a final, desperate lunge, Ray reached the top of the cliff and pulled himself over the edge, gasping for air. He looked down and saw the creatures pacing below, their eyes fixed on him like they were sizing him up. They weren't giving up that easily. Ray leaned against the rocks, trying to catch his breath. He could feel the sweat pouring down his face, his body trembling with exhaustion. But for the first time, he felt a sense of triumph. He had made it. He had survived the first wave. But the trial wasn't over yet. Zara's voice echoed in his ear. Good. You have made it this far, she said, her tone still emotionless. But you must now face the true test. Ray's heart skipped a beat. What, you mean there's more? I just ran for my life, and now you want me to do, what? Dance? Zara didn't answer. Instead, she reached down, pulling something from the ground, a massive metal staff, roughly the size of Ray himself. She swung it effortlessly, her muscles flexing with each motion. Now you must prove that your endurance goes beyond mere survival. You will face me. Ray froze. Wait, what? Before he could react, Zara swung the staff toward him with terrifying speed. He dodged, barely avoiding the strike, but the force of the blows still sent him stumbling back. His heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't what he had signed up for. Zara moved with a grace and power that was almost too much for Ray to keep up with. Her strikes were calculated, each one aimed to test his agility, his reflexes, his will to survive. He blocked one attack with his arm, feeling the force reverberate through his bones. Another strike came at his chest, and he ducked just in time. Is this what your bonding ritual is all about? Ray grunted, his muscles screaming in protest. Zara didn't respond. She only continued the assault, showing no mercy. Ray was starting to feel the weight of the fight. His arms were heavy, his legs sore from the earlier tests. He had no idea how much longer he could keep this up. But there was no choice. He had to survive, not just for himself, but for his crew, for humanity, for the pride he had built his reputation on. Each strike, each dodge, each breath was a battle. But Ray wasn't about to give up. Not now. Not when he was so close to proving himself. He may have been human, but he wasn't going down without a fight. Ray's body felt like it was on fire. Every inch of him screamed in pain, his muscles aching from the constant strain of running, climbing, and now dodging Zara's relentless attacks. Sweat poured down his face as he barely managed to avoid another brutal strike from the Vrixian warrior's staff. It was as if her movements were a blur, faster than anything he'd ever encountered. His heart raced, and his breath came in ragged gasps as he desperately tried to maintain his footing. Zara didn't relent. She was a force of nature, moving with the fluidity of a predator stalking its prey. Ray's mind raced as he tried to find an opening, some weakness in her form. But every time he thought he had a chance, she was already one step ahead. "You're fast," Ray grunted, dodging another strike. "I'll give you that." Zara didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her strikes were deliberate, each one aimed with deadly precision. It was clear she wasn't just testing his physical abilities. This was about more than survival. It was about proving something, about showing him the difference between his humanity and her species' superiority. But Ray wasn't about to give up. He had been in situations like this before, outgunned, outmatched, and outclassed, but he had survived them all. This time, though, he had to dig deeper. He had to do more than rely on sheer instinct. He moved in, ducking under another wild swing of her staff, and for the first time, he saw an opening. Zara's stance was slightly off balance for just a moment, enough for him to capitalize on. Without thinking, he lunged forward, grabbing onto the staff as it passed too close to him. Zara's eyes narrowed in surprise, but she didn't immediately pull back. Instead, she twisted the staff, forcing Ray to adjust his grip. He could feel the raw power in her hands as she fought to shake him off, but Ray held on, refusing to let go. It wasn't just about fighting anymore. It was about proving he could stand his ground. With a grunt, Ray used his momentum to flip over the staff, landing behind her. His breath came in quick, sharp bursts, and for a moment, he thought he might have the upper hand. But before he could react, Zara spun around in an instant, her staff striking out with lightning speed. Ray barely managed to raise his arm in time to block the blow, the impact knocking him off balance and sending him crashing to the ground. He gritted his teeth, shaking off the dizziness. This wasn't over. Not yet. Zara loomed over him, her towering form casting a long shadow. Ray could feel the heat radiating off her body, but he refused to look away. He wasn't about to let her see that he was scared. He'd faced bigger threats, scarier enemies, but this was different. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for respect, for understanding, for something deeper. She didn't give him time to recover. She swung again, and Ray scrambled to his feet, just barely dodging the blow. His legs were shaky, his vision blurring from exhaustion, but he kept his focus. He had one shot at this. In a split second, Ray realized the key to winning wasn't brute strength or speed. It wasn't about matching her blow for blow. It was about outthinking her. About using the environment, about finding a way to turn the fight in his favor. As Zara closed in again, Ray faked a stumble, letting her think she had him on the ropes. She swung her staff downward, aiming to knock him out cold. But Ray wasn't where she expected him to be. He rolled to the side at the last possible moment, his heart pounding as he slid across the ground. With a quick move, Ray grabbed a small rock from the ground and threw it directly into the air, distracting Zara just long enough for him to grab her staff once again. This time, he used it to his advantage, swinging it around and knocking her off balance for just a second. Zara's eyes flashed with surprise, but she didn't falter. She quickly regained her footing and locked eyes with him, a look of begrudging respect beginning to form on her face. Ray's chest heaved with exhaustion, but there was a fire in his eyes now, a determination that hadn't been there before. "You're good," Ray said between breaths. "But I'm not going down that easily." Zara paused for a moment, and for the first time in this fight, Ray saw something in her expression that wasn't just a warrior's cold focus. There was a hint of something else, something almost approving. "You are persistent," she said, her voice steady but not as harsh as it had been before. "That is a rare trait among your kind." Ray smirked, wiping the blood from his lip. You've got to be kidding me. This is your idea of a compliment. Zara's lips twitched upward, just slightly, but it was enough to make Ray feel like he'd won something, even if it was small. She wasn't giving him praise in the way he was used to, but it was a step forward. She was acknowledging him as an equal, someone who had the strength to stand with her, not just survive her trials, but challenge them. But the challenge wasn't over yet. Ray wiped his brow, still feeling the sting of fatigue settling in. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep this up. But then again, giving up wasn't really in his vocabulary. Not when there was something bigger at stake here than his pride. Not when there was a chance to prove that humans could hold their own, even in a world of giants. Zara didn't seem to be done with him. She raised the staff again, her eyes still focused, unwavering. "The final test awaits," she said. Ray's heart sank a little. He had no idea what this final test would entail, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to make it easy for her. Not now. Not ever. With a deep breath, Ray adjusted his stance, preparing himself for whatever came next. It didn't matter how many tests Zara threw at him. He was human. And if there was one thing he knew how to do, it was to keep going until the very end. No matter the odds. Ray stood at the edge of the arena, his chest heaving with exhaustion, but his mind was sharp, focused. Zara's voice still rang in his ears. "The final test awaits." There was no more room for mistakes, no more running. He had survived her earlier challenges, but he knew this one would be different. This wasn't just about physical endurance anymore. It was about proving that he could adapt, that he could survive whatever she threw at him. Zara stepped forward, her towering figure casting a long shadow over Ray. She didn't look tired, didn't seem to show any signs of wear despite their earlier battle. Her every move was deliberate, controlled. This wasn't just about strength, it was about control, mastery over the situation. Ray, still trembling from the earlier tests, forced his muscles to stay steady. His body was battered, but his pride was still intact. "What's the final test?" he asked, trying to mask the strain in his voice. "More monsters? More running?" Zara didn't answer immediately. She simply stood there, watching him, her gaze unwavering. For a moment, Ray wondered if she was sizing him up, determining if he had what it took to pass her test. The silence stretched, making him feel even more exposed. Finally, Zara spoke. "The final test is not about your body. It's about your mind. You will face a challenge that tests your resolve, your willpower. You will face the unknown, and you will decide how far you're willing to go." Ray raised an eyebrow. "Will it involve fighting some weird alien creature? Or is this a mental challenge? Because I've got to be honest, I'm not in the mood for riddles." Zara's lips twitched slightly, a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "The challenge is simple. You will enter the trial chamber, and you will confront your greatest fear." Ray froze. A chill ran down his spine. "Greatest fear?" he repeated, trying to keep his voice steady. "You've got to be kidding me. I've survived being shot at, chased by monsters, and faced down the worst that space has to offer. What could possibly scare me?" Zara's eyes locked onto his. "The question is not what scares you. It is what you are willing to confront." Ray's mind raced. He had never considered himself someone who was afraid. Fear had no place in his world of constant danger and survival. But something about Zara's words struck him differently. Was there something lurking in his past, in his mind, that he was avoiding? Some deep-seated fear he'd buried under layers of bravado? Without giving him a chance to ponder further, Zara turned and gestured toward a dark entrance at the far end of the arena. The trial chamber. Ray could feel his pulse quicken as he stared at the blackness beyond. It was as if the air around it shifted, the space growing heavier with each passing second. "I know you are human," Zara's voice echoed. "Your species is known for its courage. But true courage is not in facing the unknown with blind confidence. It is in facing it with understanding. Only then can you prove your strength." Ray swallowed hard. He had no idea what awaited him in that chamber. no idea how to prepare for something as intangible as fear. But there was no turning back. He couldn't back down now, not when he was this close to earning Zara's respect, and more importantly, a chance to prove that humans were more than just an afterthought in the galaxy. With a final, shaky breath, Ray walked toward the entrance of the trial chamber. As he passed through the threshold, the darkness seemed to engulf him, pulling him deeper into the unknown. His heart raced in his chest, each beat thundering in his ears. He wasn't sure what he expected, but the stillness, the silence, was almost suffocating. It was as if time had stopped altogether. And then, just as quickly as the silence had come, it was broken. The ground beneath Ray's feet shifted. He stumbled, trying to regain his balance, but the world around him was warping, changing. The darkness receded, and suddenly he found himself standing on a familiar street. He recognized it instantly. It was his childhood neighborhood. He was back on Earth. His heart skipped a beat. He hadn't thought about this place in years. The houses were the same, the trees the same, everything looked just as he remembered it. He could even hear the faint hum of the city in the distance. But there was something off about the scene. It felt wrong, distorted, like a memory he'd forgotten but never truly let go of. Ray took a step forward, confusion clouding his thoughts. What was this? Why was he here? As he walked, the feeling of dread only grew stronger. The houses around him were too quiet, too still. There were no people, no sounds of life. It was as if the entire world had been frozen in time, waiting for him to make the next move. Suddenly, a voice broke the silence. Ray! It called, a familiar tone that made his stomach lurch. Ray, where are you? His breath caught in his throat. It was his mother's voice. He hadn't heard it in years. The memory of her had faded over time, buried beneath all the things he'd done, the places he'd been. But hearing her voice now felt like a punch to the gut. Mom? Ray called out, his voice trembling. Where are you? The sound of footsteps echoed behind him, but when he turned, there was no one there. The streets were empty, and yet the voice called out again, closer this time. Ray! Ray, you need to come home. You can't keep running. His pulse quickened, panic creeping into his chest. The memories flooded back, his mother, his home, the day she had died. The day he'd left everything behind. The day he had sworn to never look back. You can't outrun it forever, Ray, the voice said, this time full of pain. You left me. You left us. Ray's breath hitched as the world around him seemed to close in. He could feel his body trembling, the weight of the past crashing over him like a tidal wave. He had never truly faced it, never confronted the guilt, the fear that had driven him to leave everything behind in the first place. No, Ray whispered, shaking his head. This isn't real. This isn't, you can't be here. I left you. I left all of you. The shadows around him deepened, and the voice grew more insistent. You can't outrun your past, Ray. You can't outrun your fears. Ray closed his eyes, trying to block out the sound, but it was useless. The fear, the guilt, the shame, it all came flooding back, overwhelming him, drowning him in the very emotions he had spent his entire life running from. He dropped to his knees, the weight of his past too heavy to bear. I'm sorry, he whispered, the words barely escaping his lips. I'm so sorry. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the darkness around him receded. The voice fell silent. The world around him began to fade, and the trial chamber returned to its empty, oppressive silence. Ray was left kneeling, gasping for breath, his body trembling with exhaustion and emotion. He had faced it. His greatest fear. Not the monsters or the trials, but the parts of himself he had buried deep inside. And somehow, despite everything, he had survived it. As the chamber light flickered back to life, Ray stood, his legs unsteady, his chest tight with emotion. Zara stood in the doorway, watching him, her expression unreadable. You have faced your fear, she said, her voice calm. And you have survived. Ray nodded, though words eluded him. He had made it through. But this wasn't just about passing a test anymore. It was about finally coming to terms with himself. Finally understanding that strength wasn't just about fighting or surviving, it was about facing the truth, no matter how painful. And as Zara stepped aside, allowing him to leave the chamber, Ray realized that he wasn't just leaving with respect from an alien species. He was leaving with something far more valuable, a piece of himself he had almost forgotten.